You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast.
You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. My name is Shawn Wilkie, and along with my awesome co-host, we interview the innovators in this space every week. Super excited to get started today. Ivan, please go ahead and introduce today's guest.
Hi, I'm Ivan Zach, and I'm very excited to introduce you to a colleague of mine, a veterinarian, David Haworth. David is a DVM PhD, and he's the president and co-founder of Vidium Animal Health, a startup in genomic diagnostics. He's a former president of PetSmart Charities in the US and Canada, and former president and CEO of Morris Animal Foundation. Prior to those roles, he spent 11 years at Pfizer Animal Health in various roles, including Director of Global Alliance with the Business Development Group and Director of Clinical Development within R&D. He's passionate about this profession, and also he is a strong believer in the power of teams and that leaders' primarily responsibility is setting the vision that the rest of the team members can buy into. Welcome to the show. Thank you for finding the time.
Ivan, Shawn, it's great to be here with you guys. Thanks. I've been a longtime fan of the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being a listener. I actually was looking at the stats of our show as of the end of the year, and we're something like 60,000 crazy listeners now, and there's a lot of traction. So thank you being one of them. But this is not about this show. It's about you and about what you do. You're officially one of those people that you can start scrolling through the LinkedIn page, and I caught myself that I wasn't looking at the timeline of Facebook. That is still you. So you had so many incredible roles, and what a great background. And I love people that sort of switch not the profession, but within the profession, switch what they do, entrepreneurial. So really cool story. Can you tell me that experience when you decided to switch from clinical practice and go out in the world and do something else, but still within the profession? How did that happen?
Yeah. So we could talk about that part all hour because it's a fun story. I started vet school like a lot of us, got into it, realized I loved science. I come from a family of academics, and so the university system was a pretty comfortable place. I sort of thought I would be an academic for the rest of my life. Had a moment of panic my senior year in veterinary school after I'd already gotten a PhD that I was never going to be a real veterinarian. I would never see that overweight 2-year-old golden retriever with pyometra at 9 o'clock or who just came into the clinic at 5 o'clock. And somehow I thought that would be a lack of my life. And so found a job in Spokane, Washington, great practice, 800 square foot in a strip mall between a Chinese restaurant and a dry cleaner. You can't make that kind of stuff up. And spent, the better part of a year doing just that, being a real practicing veterinarian. I did feel like the impact that I was making, while extraordinarily deep into these lives of the clients and the pets that I was serving, it wasn't as broad as I had been trained and wanted to do. And so I started looking at industry, and that was that leap, was to say, I can't be a hero, or it's harder, I should say, to be a hero when you're in pharmaceutical industry or in large non-for-profits, but you're still making an impact just at a much broader space. So that was sort of the transition moment, the real crux issue.
That's amazing. So you were well prepared for this transition, and I bet you don't miss those juicy pie mitras.
Well, some days.
Some days. So genomics, that's what we're about to talk here about. This word is alongside with machine learning or artificial intelligence, and blockchain. Is genomics could be the third word next to it that people are like, oh, I heard about it, and pretend
Right.
that they know what it is. What is it? You're a CEO and a founder of the company that is doing it. So what is
Yep.
genomics, and how does that influence our industry, and what are you trying to change?
Well, I mean, I think just like those other technologies you mentioned, Ivan, it's the great hype cycle. When we started thinking about genomics as the human genome was originally described in 2002, and it was this, okay, it's going to change everything. Now we have the key to life, and particularly when it comes to disease, it's really clear. I mean, the consensus position is that almost all diseases have some genetic component to either their derivation or the susceptibility to them. But cancer is the easiest one for us to know. Through the work of some really solid science over the last couple of decades, it's clear that cancer is a disease of mutations. So sequential mutations, and actually this was described best by a group at Johns Hopkins, where my co-founder did his training as a PhD. And we know that as mutations accumulate, cancer eventually takes over, hence why radiation causes cancer, why sunlight causes cancer. And so genomics in general, particularly in this application of genomic diagnostics, is understanding those mutations so that we therefore can understand what's causing cells, in the case of cancer, to divide uncontrollably, and how can we circumvent those pathways. If there's a brake line that was cut, how do we reestablish the brakes to those cells? If it's an accelerator that's getting pushed for cell division, how do we take the foot off the accelerator? And on the human side, just the last point, on the human side, this has revolutionized healthcare. There are 145 drugs targeted to these molecular pathways that have been approved by the FDA for human cancer. In veterinary medicine, we have 3, and they're not great. They're not targeted, but also because we're veterinarians, we can, as long as the FDA has approved it for one species, we can go ahead and use it in our species of interest.
Makes sense. So to simplify it for someone like Shawn, what do you actually do? Do you create diagnostics? Do you
Right.
create those drugs? Do you target particular cancers and you're developing a drug? Like, what does your company do and what's the goal?
Yeah, of course. Sorry, I got ahead of ourselves. So Vidium is a diagnostic company, pure play. We create diagnostic tests. We have 2 that are on the market. We've got our primary one of Searchlight DNA, which looks at the 120 genes most relevant to cancer, both the prognosis of cancer once you know that it's there, but also the diagnosis. There are certain genetic abnormalities that are diagnostic for certain types of cancer. And then maybe most interestingly for veterinarians is therapeutic indications. What drugs will most likely work for this cancer? And it's a real paradigm change in terms of personalized medicine, knowing that this dog has this mutation and this therapy should impact the downstream effects of that mutation, as opposed to what we've always been trained to do, Ivan, which is 45% of lymphomas will respond to a CHOP protocol, and therefore we should just, we're playing the odds. Personalized medicine takes a very different approach to that and says, what's going on with this patient in front of me at this time?
That's awesome, David. So the question that I often ask is like, this journey is long and got a bunch of winding roads, and it's very interesting. But what made you want to leave large organizations, whether they're not for profit or for business, and become an entrepreneur?
So I mentioned I come from an academic background. My parents also started a company while they were professors at a major university, and so I watched that entrepreneurial journey too. And to me, it's really a question of how's the best way to have an impact. And sometimes the best way to have an impact is to have the resources of a massive organization. I've worked for 2 Fortune 50 companies, and there are incredible people doing incredible things. But because of the nature of human organizations, it's oftentimes hard to do something that's a little risky. That's where you're going to have to make bunches of micro pivots because you just know that there are questions that you don't yet have answers for at the beginning. And so in this case, the opportunity presented itself through some friends. And, I'm also at a stage in my career where I can take some chances like that. We're having a blast. We've created an extraordinary team, really built a company that's based on unimpeachable science. And we were able to create the culture that we intentionally wanted to create from the beginning.
That's super cool. So then the next question is like, what's got you most excited as we kind of inch towards 2022? What's exciting that's happening in the organization, and whatever you can share with us and our listeners?
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity. We are about to launch a Series A funding round. So we've been going on some angel investments, not a small angel investments, but it's time for us to kind of have a coming out party and talk to the investment community and actually get the feedback that only a funding round can get you. We've also been focused almost exclusively on medical oncologists. We think that that's the right thing to do because medical oncologists are, they're the keystone when it comes to cancer therapies. If a diagnostic isn't accepted or at least understood or exposed to medical oncologists in the veterinary community, our premise is that GPs have a difficult time fact checking it. Like, none of us learn genomics to the extent that we'd like to in school. And so we need some kind of implied credibility, or maybe take it less mercenary, we need the oncologists to understand what it is that we're doing. So we spent the last year really focused on those 420 or so medical oncologists. We actually have one of them on our team, and trying to make sure that the science is not overly scary. Now, 2021, as all of us know, has been a really kind of a weird year to try to start this. And all veterinarians are slammed, don't have a whole bunch of time to go back and take Genomics 101, and specialists even more so. But coming into 2022, we're going to be refocusing many of our, or I should say, expanding the focus of our outreach to general practitioners. And we know that this is some scary stuff, but we also know that oncologists can't see all the patients. And that's something that the truth of the matter is, even with the wildest assumptions, you're seeing 1 in 5 of cancer cases that pet parents want to pursue. And we think that by expanding out into the general practitioners, we're doing us a service, but we're also very careful about the way we message this stuff. And it's complex and complicated, but understandable.
That's that's very interesting approach, and I'm involved now in building the group of hospitals, and we're now arriving to the point, I think, in the industry where specialists, not only oncologists but any specialists, are really hard to come by. So the throughput through the medical or veterinary healthcare system is terrible right now because the demand is overwhelming the supply. The supply workflows are really slow because they were, changed by the curbside and all that stuff. So seeing those patients that need to be seen with the oncology, which is pretty much almost every patient ends life with oncology,
Right.
then it's really difficult. So I love the approach. I love that you're getting authority from the oncologist and then looking for the ways to actually provide it to general sort of veterinary population, if you will. So I think that's a really, really good approach. I think we'll have to eventually. I was just talking to someone who used to be a head of specialties in a large organization in Canada, a friend of mine, and we had this interesting conversation about specialists, how hard it is to get, and we need to come up with some other workflows and how we access those specialists. It can't be just in this center, there's this group of people. So I think that's very important.
Ivan, I mean, let me just throw a couple of statistics because this is where we live at the moment. This is our market, right? In the state of Oklahoma, there is one boarded oncologist. She works 2 days a week. In the
Mm.
city of Phoenix, Arizona, which is in the city, metropolitan area of Phoenix, which is the fifth largest city in the US, there are 3 boarded oncologists. One has gone completely to telemedicine, and the other 2 aren't taking new patients. I know that these folks, they're all, I mean, every veterinarian, one of the things I love about our profession is that at some point, all of us decided we wanted to devote our energy, skills, time, and effort towards pets or animals in general. I love that about the profession. So all of us are trying our hardest, but it's a numbers game. And
Yep.
to find specialists today is next to impossible. And again, everyone's trying really hard, but we need to be able to expand the options of care out to every veterinarian. And for that matter, we need to leverage every veterinarian because even then it's not enough. So yeah, thank you for your words. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think we're at a place where we need to rise up our whole profession because it's a wonderful profession with some pretty significant challenges right now.
Yeah, we need to think outside of the box and change the workflows. It can't be linear dependence anymore on add number of vets and you'll add number of patients process. It needs to be the telemedicine. It needs to be, needs to be other things, which
Leveraging
some of those.
paraprofessionals and
Yeah,
using
exactly.
technologies,
Yeah.
bringing diagnostics earlier into the process. We also know this from pet parents that we talk to, again, from a genomic diagnostic standpoint, when your neighbor or goodness forbids the one of your family members gets breast cancer, it's not breast cancer that we knew about 15 years ago. It's HER2 positive, or ER negative, or triple positive breast cancer. We're starting to define cancer types on the human side by the mutations that exist there. And pet parents expect that ability in veterinary medicine. And for us, that's kind of where Vidium starts and ends, is that we're providing those opportunities, those tools, and hopefully the expertise and knowledge that goes with it.
Yeah, super exciting, David. I mean, one of the things that stood out to me when I saw your talk a couple months ago, just half a year ago now, was just how excited you are about the work that you're doing, and it's clear today as we're talking through this episode of the podcast that you're very jazzed up about it. But there's got to be some stories that you've kind of like anecdotal stories that you can share with our listeners from the path kind of so far since you guys started of like, what is the result, with the pet parent or the clients that are using your service. And I'm just wondering if you can share a few with us.
Probably too many, more than we have time for. But, the fun part for us is when we see the light bulbs click on for people. Genomics is scary. Ivan, you addressed it at the very beginning. Like, not many of us, including myself, went through an era where oh yeah, we understand the difference between a single nucleotide insertion or deletion versus a copy number variant. The cool thing is that's what we've got. We've got those scientists on board, and we actually make all of them available. So on our team, we have one of the top cancer genomicists in all of animal world, Will Hendricks, who's a co-founder of mine. And then we also have a boarded anatomic pathologist, Dr. Derek Whitley, and then we have our boarded medical oncologist, Esther Chon, and then we've got our expanded team of about 15 total. And one of the things that we do with our reports, we list out all of the relevant genomic mutations. We give pretty detailed explanations of what that means, but then we also make all of those experts available to the veterinarian to say, hey, we get this. None of us came out of the womb understanding what this mutation or this molecular pathway means. Let us give you the words that help you. And so examples kind of fall into a couple of different categories. The one is the diagnostic that's just really hard. The round cell tumor for a very dedicated pet parent that you can't tell, is this a mast cell? Is it a spindle cell tumor? Is it a soft tissue sarcoma? They all look the same. And so if I don't have a name to put on it, not only do I not know how to treat it, but it's also much scarier. If I have a name, it decreases the fear. And cancer in our beloved ones, in our pets, is a scary time. So what we like to see is when pet parents say, look, I know that it was a bad prognosis. It's cancer. It's not, there are very few good cancers to have, but I now have a name that I can put on it that I didn't before. I now have a treatment that I can think through. I know it's a prognosis. Do I focus on quality of life or do I focus on extension of life? And I also know where my treatment options are. The second big bucket of exciting things that we've seen has been veterinarians decreasing or better understanding the new therapeutic options that they have available to them off label. Now, our friends at PhytoCure have been doing this now for 3 years, so hands off to them. But we don't supply the drugs because we feel as a diagnostic lab, we should be doing the diagnosis and then facilitating the availability of these drugs. But one of the things Dr. Chon has done as part of her role as head of veterinary affairs at Vidium has been creating a pharmacopoeia, understanding with monographs, what are these new therapeutic options? Like, I can barely spell olaparib, and I'm the president of the company. But olaparib is a really powerful targeted therapeutic that is used commonly in human medicine. And we have actually quite a lot of data in dogs, safety data. Efficacy data is harder to come by, but in humans, you've got huge amounts of efficacy data. And so one of the things we like to say here is we like to use humans as our experimental model for the species of our interest. And when you've got hundreds of billions of dollars that are being poured into human oncology, we should be able to leverage a lot of that. Now, dogs aren't humans and humans aren't dogs, but there are clear lessons that can be taken. And, the only thing I would say about the targeted therapies, we're seeing a lot more veterinarians starting to understand these are almost all orally available compounded drugs. They are not cytotoxics, meaning that, if I'm a general practitioner, I stay away from doxorubicin as a therapeutic because I need a biosafety hood, I need trained personnel, and I don't know it, right? But these targeted therapeutics, by and large, are orally available and can be compounded for our patients. And so while it's not true to say that we know everything we need to know about these drugs, it is also not true to say we don't know anything about them. And so one of our roles we see is an educational aspect of that, creating these monographs on the, say, dozen or so targeted therapies that come frequently up in our tests as we run them.
So cool.
And I am very psyched about it. Sean. It's a, it's just an exciting time.
So that's very exciting. Before we ran out of time, we always do. So, but I do want to ask you this. It's a little bit of a different question, but this is for self promotion for you as well as softball. So I'm pitching right now to investors, and when I meet with investors, and I have to start with the industry and and the whole background and where it's developing and CAGR of the vet domain and this and that. What are the investors that you're looking for that will click in at least on 30th slide of your presentation
Right.
rather than on the first one? Who are you looking for? You're going to be at VMX and you're going to be in Vegas. The good thing, there's no COVID in Florida, I heard, in the
Right.
United States. So
Right.
we feel safe. So you're going to be in those two. If there will be investors there that you want to connect with, who are you looking for as investors?
And Dave, they listen to the show as well, so feel free to give your ideal investor now.
Thanks, guys. I mean, we are launching this, and we think that there's actually a broad range of investors who might be interested in what we do. So first of all, let me say we think we're doing good in this company. We built a culture that's solid, and we know that we can execute. But we also think it's a really good business. I think it would be presumptive to say billions of dollars, but if you look at the two biggest diagnostic companies, Antech and IDEX, those are some pretty serious market valuations that create, and Zoetis is clearly making a big push into this area too. So there's a lot of smart heads out there who believe that diagnostics is a smart place to invest for lots of different reasons. We have two groups of investors that we're looking for. One are straight finance guys and companies, firms that are looking for an investment thesis into the companion animal space, understand the competitive advantages of diagnostics, understand us being able to leverage all the investment that's going on in humans. We are incubated within the Translational Genomics Research Institute, which is one of the top 3 genomics institutes of the country. We're still technically inside them, although we're investable. And that has allowed us to get to the very leading edge of everything. We can evaluate it. We can make it cost appropriate for veterinary medicine. So I think there's a great discussion to be had with pure on financial investors who want to look at the bottom line. There's also the strategic investors that we'd love to have conversations with, those groups of practices who are progressive, who pride themselves on offering what we offer. Our test is not inexpensive. Our primary test, Searchlight DNA, is $750 to the veterinarian, although we give the first one complimentary so people get a little bit over the fear factor of, oh my gosh, it's a genetic diagnostics. We can run it on, basically, we just need cells from the tumor. So it can be a fine needle aspirate, it can be FFPE sections, it can be a core biopsy, it can be excisional biopsy. And we're also going to be rolling out a boutique cancer anatomic pathology service in the coming months with some of the biggest names in this space that we've been fortunate enough to get to come on board because they believe in this power of genomic diagnostics and that whole picture of we need to understand everything we can about that. So group practices, other companies, certainly there's a play here to be discussed with pharmaceutical companies. Certainly my old colleagues at Pfizer Animal Health, now Zoetis, or have a conversation about, well, if we know what molecular pathways are there, and there are compounded drugs we can bring in from the human side, there's probably veterinary specific drugs that are also useful. So there's some information, some data that we probably can share. And I think that would be an interesting value thesis. And then the last group are the private equity and venture capital groups that are clearly targeting animal health because they see all those things you mentioned at the beginning, Ivan. There's great CAGR, there's low regulatory burden, there is a strong play, and there is no breaking this tailwind of human animal bond growth. These are parts of our family. Right now, we cannot get the kinds of information we need when the scariest disease of all comes along. And Vidium can offer that. And we can do it at scale, and we can do it all. We built it in the right way.
Sounds like a hot opportunity. Well, listen, David, it's been our absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Really looking forward to seeing you again in Florida. And then again in Vegas. Thanks for joining us. We've got 2 questions before we wrap up. The first is a book, a TED Talk, a YouTube video, something that you found that was inspiring on your career path so far.
So, I like one book so much that my family made a drinking game out of it. So every time I brought the book up, they started to somebody had to drink somewhere in the world. It's called Enlightenment Now by a guy named Steven Pinker, who's a neuropsychologist at Harvard, and he's written a number of books around science. But it basically says that the Enlightenment philosophy, the philosophy of being able to define problems, set up questions to be able to answer those problems, is monumentally increase the goodness in this world, for lack of a better term. And then he goes through 19 different ways that in the last 170 years, we've gotten better. So Enlightenment Now, it's probably one of the most uplifting and inspirational books that I've seen in a decade or so.
Awesome. Well, there's someone that needs to take 3 drinks through this episode. And and is there a guest that you can recommend for us to invite to this show that you think would be interesting for our listeners?
I've got a lot of friends. Again, this profession has been so good to me, and we've been able to have such a network of groups. But one of the areas that I've really focused a lot on is the human animal bond and the science behind the human animal bond. I was one of the founding members of the Human Animal Bond Research Institute, or HABRI. One of my close colleagues is currently the chief veterinary officer at Zoetis, Mike McFarland. You do a lot worse than to have Mike on for an episode. And then secondly, the executive director of HABRI, Stephen Feldman, would be another great guest. There's just a lot of science behind the good that these animals do. Now, a lot of it's confirmatory because, a golden retriever on your lap makes you feel better. That's just a fact. But we can also put some good science behind it, and that helps, I think.
Thank you so much for listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. If you want to hear about our new episodes, please follow us on any social media channel. Also, you can check out our website at veterinaryinnovationpodcast.com. See you next week.